A pristine white wedding dress, stained with freezing mud and blood. A heavy iron dowry chest, violently smashed and emptied. And a bride, discarded like broken timber in the merciless blizzards of the Bitterroot Mountains, screaming until her lungs gave out. She had no legs, lost to a childhood illness, and her new husband had just stolen her fortune, unhitched the horses, and left her to the wolves. History books tell you the American West was won by noble pioneers, but the forgotten diaries of the 1880s hide far darker, bloodier truths. This is the chilling, true-to-life account of brutal betrayal, impossible survival, and a lonely mountain man who offered redemption where the world offered only ice. The winter of 1,883 inches, the Idaho Territory was not just cold, it was a physical weight that crushed the life out of anything caught in its path. For Clara Pendleton, the bitter wind howling through the jagged peaks of Lolo Pass was the soundtrack to her execution. Clara was not a typical pioneer woman. The daughter of Arthur Pendleton, a wealthy railroad financier based in Missoula, Clara had been afforded every luxury a frontier boomtown could offer. But wealth could not buy back the legs she had lost to a ravaging bone fever when she was only 9 years old. Amputated just above the knees, she had spent her life navigating a world built for the whole, relying on heavy, cumbersome wooden prosthetics and beautifully carved cedar canes. Despite her sharp mind and undeniable beauty, high society whispered about the crippled heiress. Enter Bartholomew Wallace. Bart was a charismatic, silver-tongued cattle broker from Spokane. He courted Clara with a fierce, seemingly blind devotion, ignoring the whispers and focusing entirely on her, or so she thought. Arthur Pendleton, desperate to see his daughter settled and safe before his failing heart gave out, offered a staggering dowry, $10,000 in gold certificates, effectively buying Bart's lifelong commitment. They were married in a lavish ceremony in late November. Bart insisted on an immediate romantic honeymoon trip to his newly purchased ranch in the Idaho Panhandle, despite the looming winter storms. He packed Clara, her heavy dowry chest, and a few meager supplies into an enclosed buckboard wagon, and they set off into the mountains. 3 days into the journey, near the treacherous summit of Lolo Pass, the wagon abruptly halted. The snow was already 3 feet deep, a blinding white maelstrom. Clara, wrapped in heavy furs, watched in confusion as Bart climbed into the back of the wagon. He didn't speak. His eyes, usually warm and crinkling with laughter, were cold, flat, and entirely alien. He reached past her, grabbed the iron dowry chest, and dragged it out into the snow. "Bart, what are you doing?" Clara asked, her breath pluming in the freezing air. He returned with a heavy iron crowbar. Without a word, he smashed the lock of the chest, transferring the heavy bundles of gold certificates into his saddlebags. "The horses can't pull this weight, Clara," Bart said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "And honestly, neither can I." "What are you saying?" Panic seized her throat. "I'm saying a half-woman is a heavy burden, but $10,000 makes a man awfully light on his feet." Bart stepped back, unhitching the 2 strong draft horses from the wagon. He swung himself onto the back of the lead horse. "They'll say the wagon slipped. A tragic accident. Goodbye, Clara." He spurred the horses, disappearing into the blinding white squall, leaving Clara stranded in a wooden box, slowly being buried by the blizzard. For 2 days, Clara fought. She wrapped herself in every blanket she could find. She ate the handful of hardtack left in the wagon. But by the 3rd night, the temperature plummeted to 20 below zero. The cold seeped into her bones, making her remaining stumps ache with a phantom, burning agony. Knowing she would freeze in the wagon, she dragged herself out into the snow, hauling her body forward with her bare hands, screaming for help until her throat bled. Finally, her body gave out. The darkness crept in, warm and inviting. Miles away, near the frozen banks of Placer Creek, Tobias Ricker was checking his winter trap lines. Tobias was a ghost of a man. A former Union sharpshooter who had seen too much blood at Antietam, he had retreated to the deepest, most unforgiving corners of the Bitterroots to escape humanity. He lived in absolute silence, a towering, heavily bearded mountain man who preferred the company of wolves to men. The storm had broken, leaving a deadly, crystalline stillness in its wake. As Tobias snowshoed through the deep powder, his sharp eyes caught an anomaly in the landscape, a splash of unnatural crimson. He approached cautiously, his Winchester rifle raised. What he found made his hardened heart stutter. Half buried in a snowdrift was a woman. She was clad in layers of expensive, torn silk and wool, her hands bloodied and frostbitten from dragging herself. When Tobias brushed the snow from her legs, he recoiled in shock. Where her lower legs should have been, there were only heavily strapped, crude wooden pegs, snapped off at the base from her desperate crawl. He knelt, pulling off his heavy fur glove to check her pulse. It was there, but it was a flutter, as weak as a dying moth's wing. Tobias didn't hesitate. He stripped off his heavy buffalo hide coat, wrapping her fragile, freezing body in its immense warmth. He hoisted her over his broad shoulder, abandoning his traps. He had 5 miles of treacherous, uphill terrain to cover to reach his cabin, and the sun was already dipping below the jagged peaks. For 4 days and 4 nights, Clara hovered in the liminal space between life and death. She woke in fragments, the smell of burning pine and rendered bear fat, the rhythmic shh, shh of a whetstone on steel. The agonizing, screaming pain as blood finally began to flow back into her frostbitten fingers and the stumps of her legs. When her eyes finally fluttered open and stayed that way, she found herself staring at a ceiling of rough-hewn logs. The cabin was small, built tight against the mountain winds, and suffocatingly warm. Sitting by the stone hearth was a giant. Tobias Ricker was whittling a piece of seasoned hickory. His beard was wild, streaked with premature gray, and his eyes, when they flicked up to meet hers, were the color of winter ice. Clara bolted upright, terror seizing her. She scrambled backward, hitting the log wall, her hands instinctively reaching for her legs. The wooden prosthetics were gone. Her stumps were wrapped in clean, white, boiled cotton bandages. "Don't move!" a voice rumbled. It was deep, gravelly, unused to conversation. "Frostbite! You tore your skin to ribbons. Where is he?" Clara gasped, her voice a raspy whisper. "Bart, where is my husband?" Tobias set down his knife. You were alone, 3 miles from the Lolo Summit Trail, dragging yourself through 3 feet of powder. The memories crashed down on her like a collapsing roof. The blizzard, the smashed chest, the flat, dead look in Bart's eyes as he rode away with her fortune. Clara broke. She didn't just cry. She howled. The betrayal was a physical wound, deeper than the frostbite, sharper than the phantom pain in her missing limbs. She wept for her father, who had unknowingly financed her murder. She wept for her own foolishness, for believing she could be loved whole. Tobias did not offer platitudes. He did not tell her it would be all right. He simply walked to the iron stove, poured a mug of strong, bitter chicory coffee, and set it on the small table near her cot. Then, he stepped out into the freezing cold, giving her the dignity of falling apart in private. The recovery was grueling. Clara was wholly dependent on a stranger, a terrifying reality for a woman who had fought so hard for her independence. Tobias fed her venison broth, changed her bandages, and applied foul-smelling pine pitch salves to her hands to save her fingers. They lived in a heavy, pregnant silence. Clara was defensive, expecting pity or disgust. She had seen the way men looked at her when the hem of her dress rode up to reveal wood instead of flesh, a mixture of revulsion and morbid curiosity. But Tobias never looked at her that way. To him, survival was a matter of mathematics and sheer will. He treated her missing legs with the same pragmatic detachment he used to repair a broken rifle stock. Weeks turned into a month. The snow piled higher, burying the cabin up to its windows. As Clara's hands healed, she refused to lay idle. She demanded to help. She dragged herself across the wooden floor using her arms, refusing Tobias's initial attempts to carry her. One evening, while Tobias was cleaning his Winchester, Clara sat by the fire, mending a tear in his wool shirt. "Why did you save me?" she asked, the question hanging heavy in the smoke-filled air. Tobias didn't look up from his rifle. "Found you. That's not an answer. You could have left me. I'm a cripple, Mr. Ricker. I'm a burden to a man out here." She echoed Bart's cruel words, throwing them at Tobias like a weapon, testing him. Tobias stopped wiping the barrel. He looked at her, his icy eyes locking onto hers. Seen whole men die of a paper cut because they gave up. Seen a three-legged wolf take down an elk because it was hungry. Legs don't make the survivor, Clara. The mind does. You dragged yourself 2 miles on bleeding stumps. You ain't a burden. You're the toughest goddamn thing in these mountains. The crude, honest validation cracked the thick shell Clara had built around her heart. The dynamic shifted. Tobias, noticing how much Clara struggled with the dirt floor and the cabin's layout, began a secret project. For 3 weeks, he stayed up late by the fire. He took the heavy, clumsy wooden pegs she had been wearing, the ones Bart had bought her in Spokane, designed for appearance rather than function, and threw them into the fire. In their place, he crafted something extraordinary. Using lightweight, steam-bent ashwood and supple deer hide, he built a pair of articulated prosthetics. They weren't meant to look like human legs. They were engineered for stability on uneven ground. He even carved wide, snowshoe-like bases for them. When he presented them to her, Clara was speechless. He helped her strap them onto her stumps. The leather was soft, padded with rabbit fur to prevent chafing. With Tobias holding her elbows, she stood. They were incredibly light. For the first time in months, Clara stood upright. She looked at Tobias, tears streaming down her face, and threw her arms around his thick neck. Tobias froze, completely unaccustomed to human touch, before slowly, tentatively, wrapping his massive arms around her waist. In that desolate, snow-buried cabin, a profound bond was forged. It wasn't the fiery, deceptive romance Bart had offered. It was a slow burn, built on mutual respect, shared silence, and the undeniable recognition of 2 broken souls finding symmetry in each other. Spring arrived in the Bitterroots violently. The thaw turned the mountain passes into roaring rivers of mud and snowmelt. The isolation of the long winter broke, and with the melting snow came the inescapable intrusion of the outside world. Clara was thriving. With her new ashwood legs, she had learned to navigate the rugged terrain immediately surrounding the cabin. She had learned to shoot Tobias's spare revolver, her upper body strength proving formidable. She had color in her cheeks, her hair no longer the brittle, dull mess of a dying woman, but a rich, thick auburn that caught the spring sun. But the flour barrels were empty, and the coffee was gone. It was time for the spring trading run. Tobias saddled his draft horse, leaving Clara at the cabin with the revolver and strict instructions to stay near the tree line. He rode down the mountain, descending into the bustling mining and logging town of Avery, Idaho. Avery was a pit of vice, mud, and money. Miners and loggers crowded the saloons, shaking off the winter gloom. Tobias tied his horse outside the general store, his massive frame drawing wide berths from the locals who knew the reclusive mountain man's reputation. Inside the store, as the clerk loaded sacks of flour and sugar onto the counter, Tobias listened to the idle gossip of the town. Heartbreaking, I tell you. A woman was saying by the bolts of fabric. That poor Mr. Wallace lost his bride to the mountains, and now the poor man is trying to settle her estate in Spokane. Tobias went perfectly still. He turned his head, his voice low and menacing. Who? The women jumped, intimidated by the giant. Bartholomew Wallace, Mr., one stuttered. It was in the Spokane Chronicle. His wagon went over a ravine in Lolo Pass last November. His poor wife, she was an invalid, bless her soul, went down with the wagon. He barely escaped with his life. Tobias's jaw tightened. He in Spokane now? No, sir. He's actually staying up at the Silver King Hotel right here in Avery, waiting on some Pinkerton detectives, the rumor goes. They're waiting for the mud to dry up so they can go up the pass and recover her body. The clerk chimed in, yep, turns out her daddy, old Arthur Pendleton, died of a heart spell back in February, left a massive estate. But the banks won't release the inheritance to the widower until they have proof the daughter is dead. They need her bones, or at least the wedding ring. A cold dread pooled in Tobias's gut. Bart Wallace wasn't mourning. He was hunting. He needed definitive proof of Clara's death to claim the rest of the Pendleton fortune. If the Pinkertons went up that mountain and found the smashed dowry chest but no body, they would start tracking. And a woman dragging herself through the snow leaves a trail, even months later. Tobias threw a gold eagle coin on the counter. grabbed his supplies, and stormed out. He had to get back to Clara. They had to leave the cabin and go deeper into the Bitterroots, or he had to deal with Bartholomew Wallace once and for all. As Tobias untied his horse, the double doors of the saloon across the muddy street swung open. A man stepped out, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, lighting a cigar. He had a handsome face, an easy smile, and the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he had outsmarted the world. Tobias recognized him instantly from Clara's nightmares. It was Bart Wallace. Bart leaned against the wooden railing, surrounded by two tough-looking hired guns, pointing up toward the snow-capped peaks of Lolo Pass. Tobias pulled the brim of his hat down low, mounted his horse, and spurred the animal hard toward the mountain trail. He pushed the horse to its absolute limit, the muddy trail slick and treacherous. The sun was setting by the time he reached the clearing at Pine Creek. He practically threw himself off the horse. "Clara!" he roared, bursting through the cabin door. The cabin was empty. The fire was cold. Tobias's blood ran to ice. He rushed back outside, scanning the mud. There, near the woodpile, were the distinct, round impressions of Clara's ashwood prosthetics, but they were violently scuffed, surrounded by the heavy, deep boot prints of 3 men. And lying in the mud, glinting in the fading twilight, was the heavy revolver he had left her, its cylinder empty. Clara hadn't gone without a fight. The ghosts of her past hadn't just returned. They had found her. The mud of the Bitterroot Mountains held secrets, but to a man like Tobias Ricker, it spoke in a clear, undeniable voice. Kneeling beside the scuffed impressions of Clara's ashwood prosthetics, Tobias touched the damp earth. The edges of the boot prints were still crumbling. They had less than an hour's head start. Tobias did not panic. Panic was a luxury for civilized men. Instead, the icy, detached focus of the Union sharpshooter, who had survived the bloodiest mornings of the war, settled over him like a heavy shroud. He moved back to his horse, swapping his lightweight saddle for a stripped-down riding rig. He loaded his Winchester rifle, filling his canvas bandolier with heavy 44-40 cartridges, and slipped a long, serrated hunting knife into his boot. The tracks led away from the cabin, cutting a jagged, hurried path northeast toward the jagged ravines of the Coeur d'Alene River forks. Bart Wallace had made a fatal error. He was a city man, a creature of parlors and paved streets. He had brought 2 hired guns, heavy-booted, careless men who snapped twigs and trampled ferns, leaving a trail a blind man could follow. A mile up the ridge, Clara Pendleton was living a nightmare she thought she had already survived. She was slung over the back of a massive, ill-tempered roan horse, her wrists bound tight with coarse hemp rope. Without her prosthetics, which lay discarded in the mud by the cabin, she felt a profound, humiliating vulnerability. Every step the horse took sent a jarring ache through her stumps, but she refused to cry out. She squeezed her eyes shut, focusing on the memory of the smoke in Tobias's cabin, the smell of rendered fat, the rough warmth of his hands. "Keep her steady, Hiram," Bart's voice cut through the damp evening air. He rode at the front, his expensive tailored coat splashed with freezing mud. "If she falls and breaks her neck here, it ruins the narrative." The man holding her horse's lead, a scarred brute named Hiram Rust, spat a stream of black tobacco juice onto the snowmelt. "She's squirming, Mr. Wallace. Why don't we just put a bullet in her and toss her in the creek? The Pinkertons ain't gonna care how she died. Just that she's dead." "You lack vision, Hiram," Bart said, turning in his saddle. The handsome face Clara had once thought so charming was now contorted with a vicious, arrogant greed. "Agent Thomas Sullivan of the Pinkerton Detective Agency is waiting for me in Avery. He is not a fool. A bullet hole in her skull implies murder. A shattered body at the bottom of the old logging trestle gorge implies a tragic fall while she was wandering, lost and delirious, in the winter storm. The estate lawyers in Missoula, specifically Archibald Finch, demand a clean story before they release the remaining $2 million of Arthur Pendleton's railroad shares. We do this right." Clara's breath hitched. $2 million. Her father's fortune was vast, but she hadn't realized the sheer scale of the railroad shares. Bart hadn't just married her for the $10,000 dowry. That was merely the operating capital to fund her murder. "You won't get away with this, Bart," Clara rasped, her throat dry and burning. "Tobias will find you." Bart threw his head back and laughed, a hollow, echoing sound in the dense pines. "The giant in the woods? Please, Clara. He's a savage." Virgil. He gestured to the second hired gun, a thin, wiry man with a scattergun resting on his thigh. "If the mountain man shows up, shoot him in the stomach and let him bleed out." "With pleasure, boss," Virgil chuckled. They pushed higher into the treacherous terrain as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into a deep, bruised twilight. The temperature plummeted. Clara shivered violently, the thin fabric of her dress offering no protection against the biting wind. Below them, masking his movements in the shadows of the deep ravines, Tobias stalked. He did not stay on the trail. He moved parallel to it, climbing the steep, rocky ridges to gain the high ground. His lungs burned, but his massive legs drove him upward with relentless, mechanical precision. He heard them before he saw them. The clinking of bits, the heavy thud of hooves on wet stone, the coarse laughter of men who believed they were untouchable. Tobias crested a limestone ridge. Below him, the trail narrowed, leading directly onto the rotted, skeletal remains of an abandoned logging trestle that spanned a dizzying 200-foot drop into a roaring whitewater gorge. This was their destination. Tobias dropped to his stomach in the wet ferns. He slid the Winchester forward, resting the heavy octagonal barrel on a moss-covered log. He adjusted the rear sight, judging the wind, the distance, and the fading light. He had 3 targets. He needed to be perfect, or Clara would fall. Down on the trail, the procession halted at the edge of the trestle. The bridge groaned under the weight of the horses. "Dismount," Bart ordered, pulling his revolver. "Hiram, untie her from the horse. Carry her to the middle of the span." Hiram grunted, stepping down into the mud. He reached up, roughly grabbing Clara by the waist and dragging her off the saddle. She hit the ground hard, gasping, as the impact sent fire through her legs. "Get up!" Hiram snarled, grabbing her bound hands and hauling her upright. Because she had no legs to stand on, he was forced to drag her, her dress dragging through the mud and splinters of the bridge. Clara fought. She twisted, thrashing her upper body, kicking out with her stumps. She wasn't the fragile, dying woman Bart had left in Lolo Pass. Months of hauling herself around the cabin had built dense, corded muscle in her arms and core. She threw her weight backward, causing Hiram to stumble. "Hold her still, you idiot!" Bart shouted, stepping onto the bridge. Crack. The sound of the Winchester was a thunderclap that shattered the twilight. Before Bart's shout had even finished echoing, Hiram Rust's head snapped violently forward. The 44-40 bullet took him perfectly through the base of the skull. He dropped like a stone, releasing Clara, who fell heavily against the wooden railing of the bridge. Chaos erupted. "Sniper! Up on the ridge!" Virgil screamed, leveling his scattergun wildly at the tree line. He fired blindly, the heavy buckshot shredding the pine branches 30 feet below Tobias's position. Tobias racked the lever of the Winchester. The spent brass casing ejected, spinning in the cold air. He sighted in on Virgil. Crack. The second shot caught Virgil in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his scattergun clattering over the edge of the trestle into the roaring gorge below. Virgil screamed, clutching his shattered collarbone, and scrambled behind his panicked horse for cover. Bart Wallace dropped to his knees, his face pale with sudden, blinding terror. He looked up at the darkened ridge, seeing nothing but shadows and the muzzle flash of death. "Fire back, Virgil! Fire back!" Bart shrieked, crawling on his belly toward Clara. "With what?" Virgil sobbed from the mud. Tobias stood up. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and began his descent. He bounded down the steep, rocky slope with the terrifying, reckless speed of an avalanche. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wanted Bart to see him coming. Bart reached Clara. He grabbed a fistful of her auburn hair, pulling her head back and jamming the cold steel barrel of his revolver against her temple. "Stop!" Bart screamed up at the descending giant. "Stop right there, or I swear to God I'll paint this bridge with her brains." Tobias hit the trail 50 yards from the bridge. He stopped. The mountain man looked like a demon forged from the wilderness itself, mud-streaked, breathing heavy. His icy eyes locked onto Bart with a murderous intensity. He didn't raise his rifle. He just stood there, an immovable force. "Let her go, Wallace," Tobias's voice rumbled, deep and terrifying, carrying effortlessly over the sound of the roaring gorge. "You think you're a hero?" Bart spat, his hand shaking violently against Clara's head. "You think you saved her? You're nothing but a filthy squatter. She's a Pendleton. She's worth millions, and I am her legal husband." Clara, despite the gun to her head, felt a strange, profound calm wash over her. She looked at Tobias. He wasn't looking at the gun. He was looking directly into her eyes. He gave a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. Clara understood. She stopped resisting. She let her body go completely limp, becoming dead weight. Bart, expecting her to fight, was caught off guard by the sudden shift in gravity. He stumbled forward slightly to keep his balance. In that split second, Clara violently threw her head backward, smashing her skull directly into Bart's nose with a sickening crunch. Bart shrieked, instinctively pulling the trigger as his head snapped back. The gun fired, but the barrel had slipped. The bullet grazed the side of Clara's cheek, burning a trench of fire through her skin, and buried itself in the bridge's wooden planks. Before Bart could recover and aim again, Tobias crossed the 50 yards with impossible speed. He didn't shoot. He hit Bart like a runaway freight train. The impact lifted the handsome cattle broker entirely off his feet. They crashed onto the rotted planks of the trestle, the wood groaning and splintering under their combined weight. Bart's revolver skittered away in the darkness. Bart was desperate, fighting for his life and his stolen fortune. He clawed at Tobias's eyes, bringing a knee up to strike the mountain man's ribs. But he was fighting a man who wrestled timber and trapped wolves for a living. Tobias absorbed the blows without a flinch. He grabbed Bart by the throat with one massive, calloused hand, lifting him effortlessly until Bart was pinned against the precarious, waist-high wooden railing of the bridge. Behind Bart, the gorge roared, a 200-foot drop into jagged rocks and white water. "You left her," Tobias whispered, his voice tighter than a bowstring. "You took her legs, you took her money, and you left her to freeze." "Wait!" Bart choked out, his face turning a mottled, desperate purple. "Wait! I have the money. The 10,000. It's in Spokane. I can give it to you. I can give you more. Just let me live." Tobias looked down at Clara. She was sitting up, blood pouring down the side of her face from the bullet graze, but her eyes were clear and fierce. She dragged herself across the splintered wood until she was beside Tobias. She looked up at the man who had promised her the world and delivered a frozen hell. "The Pinkertons need a body, Bart," Clara said, her voice dripping with venom. "They need a tragic fall from a great height." Bart's eyes widened in sheer, absolute horror. He looked from Clara's cold face to Tobias's dead, unblinking stare. "No. No, Clara. Please." Tobias didn't throw him. He simply let go. Bart Wallace fell backward over the railing. His scream echoed through the gorge, a long, piercing sound that was abruptly and violently cut short by the rocks below. Silence fell over the bridge, save for the rush of the river and the whimpering of the wounded Virgil, who was still cowering behind his horse. Tobias knelt beside Clara. His massive hands, which had just casually ended a man's life, were trembling slightly as he reached out and gently wiped the blood from her cheek. "You're hurt," he said softly. "I'm alive," Clara replied, leaning her head against his broad chest. "Thanks to you." Tobias scooped her up in his arms, carrying her as easily as a child. He walked over to the terrified Virgil. "You," Tobias growled. Virgil flinched, holding his bleeding shoulder. "Please, mister. I was just hired help. I didn't know the whole story." "You have a horse," Tobias said. "Ride back to Avery. Tell Pinkerton Agent Sullivan that Bartholomew Wallace slipped and fell while searching the trestle bridge. Tell him Clara Pendleton is dead, and the mountains claimed her. I will. I swear it. If you ever come back up this mountain," Tobias promised, "I won't use the rifle. Now get out of here." They did not return to the cabin immediately. Clara refused. If she was legally dead, she wanted to ensure the ghost of Bartholomew Wallace could never profit from her demise. Over the next 2 weeks, hiding in an abandoned silver mine Tobias knew of, Clara healed from her gunshot graze. Tobias retrieved her ashwood legs, and she practiced walking on the uneven rocky floor of the cavern until she was as sure-footed as a mountain goat. They formed a plan. It was audacious, dangerous, and required the absolute dismantling of Bart's legal web. A month later, a heavily cloaked woman and a towering, bearded man stepped off the Northern Pacific train at the bustling depot in Missoula, Montana. The spring air was crisp, but the city was suffocating with coal, smoke, and industry. Tobias looked deeply uncomfortable, his hand resting constantly on the heavy revolver hidden beneath his coat. They walked directly to the prestigious law offices of Pendleton and Finch, located in the heart of the brick-paved banking district. Inside the mahogany-paneled office, Archibald Finch, a sharply dressed, severe-looking attorney, was poring over ledgers. He looked up, annoyed by the intrusion. "I'm sorry, my secretary was supposed to." Finch stopped. The color completely drained from his face as the woman lowered her heavy wool hood. "Hello, Archibald," Clara said. Her voice was commanding, filled with the aristocratic authority she had learned from her father. Finch stumbled backward, knocking over his inkwell. Black ink bled across the legal documents. "Clara? Good God. But the telegrams. Mr. Wallace. The Pinkertons declared you deceased. They found Bart's body in the gorge. Bart was careless," Clara said calmly, stepping forward on her ashwood legs, the faint thump step echoing in the quiet office. "He had a tragic accident, but before he died, he confessed something very interesting to me. He confessed that he couldn't have liquidated my father's shares without the help of a very skilled, very corrupt inside man, someone who would receive a 20% cut of the $2 million estate." Finch swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the giant man standing silently by the door. Tobias crossed his massive arms, blocking the only exit. I don't know what you're talking about, Clara," Finch stammered, sweating profusely. "I am not my father, Archibald. I don't negotiate," Clara said, leaning her hands on his desk. "You are going to draw up the papers right now. You will transfer the entirety of the Pendleton estate, every railroad share, every land deed, and every gold certificate into a newly established trust. The trust will be managed solely by me. But the legal process, the courts." "Or," Clara interrupted, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "I can introduce my friend Tobias to Pinkerton agent Sullivan, who is still very curious about the anomalies in Bart's death. I'm sure Sullivan would love to look into your private banking ledgers." Finch broke. Within 2 hours, the ink was dry. The entire Pendleton fortune, an empire built on steel and steam, was placed entirely under the control of Clara Pendleton. As they walked out of the bank with the certified documents secured in Tobias's leather satchel, the noise of the city seemed to assault them. Carriages clattered, street hawkers yelled, and factory whistles blew. Tobias stopped on the boardwalk, looking up at the smog-filled sky. He looked out of place, a wild wolf, chained in a dog run. "You're a wealthy woman, Clara," Tobias said, his voice quiet. "You own half this city. You don't have to go back to a dirt floor and rendered bear fat." Clara looked at him. She saw the fear in his icy eyes, the fear that he had saved her only to lose her to the world that had cast her out. She reached up, resting her hand on his bearded cheek. "Tobias, this city took my legs. It took my father. It sent a monster to kill me. The only thing I have ever loved is in those mountains." She tapped her ashwood prosthetics with her cane. "You gave me these. You gave me my life back. And now I'm going to buy us a mountain where no one will ever bother us again." And she did. Clara Pendleton used her vast fortune not to build mansions or host galas, but to quietly purchase over 50,000 acres of pristine, untamed wilderness in the deep Bitterroots. She established a heavily guarded, private sanctuary where logging and mining were strictly forbidden. History lost track of the crippled heiress and the Union sharpshooter. They faded into local folklore, the ghost of Placer Creek and the Iron Lady of the Bitterroots. But for those who dared to venture too close to the jagged peaks of Lolo Pass, they sometimes caught a glimpse of them, a massive, bearded giant and a beautiful, fiercely strong woman walking side by side through the deep snow, unbothered by the cold, whole and unbroken in the wild edge of the world. The tale of Clara Pendleton and Tobias Ricker is a chilling reminder that the Wild West wasn't just a place of outlaws and cowboys. It was a brutal proving ground where the darkest human greed clashed with the purest will to survive. Clara's journey from a discarded, betrayed heiress freezing in the snow to the commanding architect of her own justice proves that true strength isn't measured by physical wholeness, but by the fire in one's spirit. Did this untold story of frontier betrayal and mountain redemption keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved diving into this forgotten chapter of Western history, please hit that like button, share this video with fellow history and drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible, true-to-life stories from the unforgiving American frontier. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Clara's shoes?